Yes, thank you, Stephanie. We're really excited to be here, or well, wherever we are. I'm in New York, Jennifer's in Massachusetts. We figured we would just talk through some of the big elements of Unacceptable and the case that it covers, what made it such a wild scandal, and some of the kind of lessons learned and takeaways from the book and from our reporting. And as Stephanie said, save some time at the end for audience questions. So we might as well start at what was the beginning for us, which was March 12th, 2019, and kind of how we got onto this story in the first place and onto the book.
This was a typical Tuesday. I recall coming into work and having another story I was working on, and suddenly we got a press release. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning that there was going to be a news conference at the U.S. Attorney's office in Boston. So I'm about 10 minutes from there. So I ran down there. We didn't really know exactly what it was, but we knew it was something big because the way that it came in, it was a press conference, and then the Washington, D.C. office followed up, and then the FBI. And then, so as I'm just like getting my coat, and it's a cold day running down there, we also hear that it involves some actresses, Felicity Huffman, Lori Loughlin. So this was very odd. So went down there and went up to the 9th floor of the courthouse, and the press room's packed. And the first thing I see is you see like the top brass from the FBI, the IRS, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, all there, very dressed up, like, okay, something very big is happening. There's some odd poster boards with this man's face in the middle with little arrows coming off, this weird diagram, huge stacks up for us to read. And then the U.S. Attorney gets up for Massachusetts, gets up and just says, we've just cracked the biggest education fraud case that the DOJ has ever prosecuted. And your mind is just swimming because it's not only like actresses, and what he describes as a catalog of wealth. And Melissa is listening in from New York, so I'll let her talk. But like, we just right away, this story had every element. You had wealth, you had huge names, you had college, the colleges he was listing off, Yale and USC and Stanford. And we knew that right then and there we were on a story that was not going to go away, and that pretty much became our life for the next year.
Yeah, and we were still catching our breath from the torrent of updates in that first day of writing articles for the Wall Street Journal. We'd put out news and we'd update it, we'd get a little more information, update it again. And in the mix in my inbox was a note from a literary agent. And then came a few more in the next couple of days. And Jennifer and I decided to team up and write the book. As one of them said, this is going to be a book. Do you want to be the ones to write it? So we kind of jumped in and said, sure, why not? We've never done this before. Let's do it. And then we were off, and we've covered this case from that first day that it went public. And we've looked at both in the journal, and then we expand on a lot of it in the book, the parents, the background of the case, the kind of lessons learned and big takeaways, and what this says about society. And, spoiler alert, it doesn't say good things about society right now. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves and discuss kind of what led to that event on March 12th, 2019, walk through how the scam worked. So this whole case, which the FBI dubbed Operation Varsity Blues, was based on the work of this college counselor named Rick Singer. He had two prongs to his scheme, his illegal scheme. He also had on the side, an entirely legitimate college counseling business. But one part had to do with testing. So he helped students coordinate to get special accommodations to take their SAT or ACT, and then he would send them to a test center that he essentially ran by bribing the test center administrator. And they would look the other way while a proctor that he paid off would fix the students' answers after they took the test, or sometimes just feed them the answers during the test. So that was part one. Part two of the scheme was with athletics, where he would help pitch these teens as recruited athletes, as star soccer players or rowers or sailors, even when they didn't actually play the sport. And he would bribe coaches to flag them as recruits, which is as close to a guarantee as you'll get at a lot of colleges. So all of the activities in this were based on one or the other, or sometimes both of those approaches.
And what stood out was just how complex and creative this scheme was, and in a way how smart it was. And so we dove into Rick Singer. How did this guy figure this out? And Rick Singer was a college coach himself. He was a basketball coach at Sacramento State. Before that, he was a high school coach. So he was just immersed in the world of athletics. And when he was a coach, he did a lot of recruiting himself. And so he traveled the country, and he just got to know on his downtime. He's a guy that can't sit still. He's just this wiry guy. He gets up at 4 a.m. to run. So he never took a break, and he would just go around and look at the town and look at the campus, and he studied. So he just got this education, and he had that. And then he also put together something really crucial, which is that college coaches have to do a lot of fundraising for their programs, and they hate it. They'd rather be on the court. They'd rather be on the hockey field, whatever, field hockey. So these lower level sports that don't have a lot of money, they've got to raise money for equipment and trips, and they don't like it. Many of them at the outside of football and the big showy sports like big time basketball, a lot of them are not that well paid, and certainly not that well paid compared to the peers. So they have like a little bit of resentment going on. So he just was able to tap into these like vibes of frustration that some of these coaches had, and particularly in these lower level sports. He also saw they really operated just like they had their own little fiefdoms. Nobody really looked at them, water polo, crew. So what he did was, when he became a college counselor in the 90s in Sacramento, he did, as Melissa said, he had a legitimate business. He was quite good at it. He was very confident. He knew everything about these colleges, so he could say, oh, you should try, Kenyon College, or someplace that nobody in Sacramento had ever heard of. He visited them all. He had like encyclopedic memory, but he quickly took advantage of this knowledge that he had gleaned, and he figured out that he could just go to these coaches and say, I know you have to raise a lot of money. I can help you. I can make that easier for you. I can give you money. And all you have to do is just tag this kid as a walk-on your team. You don't even have to play him, but just put him on the team, and here's some money for your program. And that kind of morphed into, here's some money for your program, and mostly here's some money for you. And of course, this was enabled by the incredible advantage that athletes have, not just scholarship athletes, but even just a walk-on athlete. It's just many times the advantage that another kid has at some of these schools. So he put that all together.
And at some point, he also figured out that there, just as there's very little oversight in certain pockets of college admissions, there's very little oversight in standardized testing. And after a little asterisk was taken away from SAT or ACT scores when somebody had special accommodations, he really kind of took advantage of that and had his clients have their kids tested for learning differences. And he would go down the testing scheme once it became, you couldn't tell when an applicant had extra time or special consideration on their tests. So they wouldn't stand out in any way, but they had additional time to fix their scores, or in his case, go somewhere so that someone else could fix the scores for them.
Yeah, and there's a big difference between parents who take advantage of, who utilize or whatever, some of these gray areas, who get the kids extra time, or who, get them into a certain sport because they know that they're going to have an advantage. With these parents, they went a whole nother, many notches up the dial, and just outright pretended that the kids were some sort of athlete. to the point of sometimes putting them in uniforms for sports they didn't play, or posing them, in one case, in the family pool with water polo equipment ordered off of Amazon. So it just went to absurd lengths. So we were just like, what went through your mind that you did this? And I think we found different reasons, but it's like mainly I think the variations we found, the main ones were ego in some cases, and some parents admitted it in court. It was just, they really cared about where their kid went to school. In some cases, it was warped thinking. They had just gotten sucked into these worlds where they had just lost perspective. They really had their sights set, like just only a very small list of schools would be a success to them. They just had gotten sucked into it, and they had just lost sight, like lost their moral compass. And then in some cases it was just intense anxiety of my kid, and is my kid going to do as good as the others, and they're going to feel bad.
But it's not like these kids were actually disadvantaged in the admissions process and needed extra help, right? They already had all of these great opportunities. They went to these private schools that had a good counselor to student ratio. They did all these extracurriculars. They were worldly teens. Their families traveled. And a line from Stephanie, I know you posted the New York Times review. Tony Jack, who wrote it, he referred to it as bumper stickers and bragging rights. And that goes to that ego part, right? That there was insecurity, but there's also this just, those people down the street are doing it. And it's a judgment on me as a parent if my kid goes to an Ivy or a state school.
Yeah, right. This definitely wasn't about, as one of the judges said, she said, this just wasn't about getting your kid into college. This was about getting your kid into a very particular college. So all these kids were going to be fine. They were going to go somewhere and do fine. And we were really interested in how readers would react. I think a lot of people come into this story just thinking that these parents are monsters and they're angry at them. And I think in some cases they read it and some people felt, okay, I understand them a little more. I don't like them, but I can see them as humans now. It's just generally a rule of thumb in journalism. The more you get to know someone, you see them more as human. And so we tried really hard to do that. And in some cases, people looked somewhat better. In some cases, they looked worse, the more you knew about them. But I think, so there was a little bit of almost feeling sorry for some of the parents that they got themselves into this, and that there were cases of, they just seemed so stressed out and so anxious. But I think on the other hand, you had people just read this and just feel like their mind was blown by the sense of entitlement that the parents had in the view of many people, because, really this was a case of people who just had been moving along in very elite circles for a long time, and they just expected to continue. And they had kids who were normal kids, nothing wrong with that for the most part. I was a pretty average student myself, and they were being told, you're not going to go to the club you want. You might have to go somewhere else. And that just wasn't acceptable to them. Unacceptable, actually, which is.
And it was hard to kind of admit. I had all these weird feelings while we were reporting this out, because I'm a parent myself, and I could relate to some of them in their insecurities. And that was, it's an uncomfortable feeling. I think my line of how far I would go for my daughter is different. But there is something universal about that desire to help a child succeed and avoid disappointment. And some parents go obviously to extremes to do that. But I found myself, and we've heard from readers too, that they see a little bit of themselves in some of these parents, and they're not proud of that, but perhaps it's a bit of a wake-up call in their own parenting as a result.
Yeah, and there's also this whole other area that's like a few notches down where it's not illegal, but they may see themselves in some of these communities that we describe too. There's these like pressure cooker environments. Uh, the
I will say, Jen, I'm just going to jump
Yeah,
in because you mentioned earlier that the more information you have about these parents, the more well-rounded they are, and they're people. They're not just names on a page anymore. And this story covering this, getting access to the parents, to just so many of them were surrounded by teams of crisis communications experts and lawyers, and the list of lawyers is all top former federal prosecutors, and you didn't even know if messages were getting to the person that you were trying to reach. So Jennifer and I flew around the country to different places, drove around, left letters in mailboxes, notes on doors, just everything we could do to try to contact them and explain, this book is happening, you're going to be in it, and we want to make sure that we're giving the full story. So here's your chance to tell us your side of it. And enough of them did that they are more than just parent number 7 who pleaded guilty.
exactly. Yeah, we had a lot of interesting times where one of us would be in the car and the other one is on a Google Doc, like trying to help navigate, because some of the neighborhoods where people lived were just so grandiose. There's no real numbers, and you certainly can't knock on doors because there's gates. So we had to get creative with trying to get that message to people. But I do think they appreciated it and thought, well, okay, maybe there is a reason why I should speak. There's something in this for me. One of the things that we were so interested in was how you go so we know Rick Singer has a whole legitimate side of his business, and some parents used him and really liked him and told us that he never said anything about this to me. And so we wanted to figure out, like, why did he go, how did he pick his prey, or how did it work? Who did he figure out, like, what were the signs they gave off? So another thing we did is we tracked down former employees of his who spoke to us and really gave us the kind of the keys to the kingdom in a way. And there were a couple different kinds of people that either fell or walked into this. And one was, there was a group that were just very transactional. They were the type of people who just had written checks for everything, and you just fix things and you pick the phone up and I'll have my guy call. And college fell into that. And it was like, this Rick Singer guy can get your kid in. I don't want to deal with this. I'm in Dubai. I'm just going to call him, and here's what, just send the check to my person. And they just wanted to get it done. And he would say that my parents want this thing done. They just want it done. They don't want the anxiety. So that was one group. And then there was this other group that they would hire him, and they would be going through regular test prep. They'd even have the list of colleges to go through. They'd set up visits. It was all very conventional. And then at some point, he would just pick up on how some sort of anxiety they had. Some of them were just so concerned about, look, my kid is a good kid. They're smart, but they're a terrible test taker. This is really going to drag them down, this SAT. Or I really want Georgetown, and he really wants Georgetown, and that's where he belongs. And so he would just get an idea, and then he would just offer, well, look, I do know a way, and you could, what he would tell people is, there's the front door where you just apply as yourself. Imagine that you just actually and you are admitted or denied based on that. Then there's the back door where you give a big donation to the school and you get in. Or there's the side door. And what he would say with the back door, it can help you, but it's not a guarantee, and you have to give a ton of money. What I have is the side door. And then he would say the magic word, which is guarantee. He would say, this is a shoo-in, this is a sure deal, it never fails. And you don't even have to pay up till it works. So if you're a stressed out person and you want this done, I think that was just.
And the parents would kind of justify it to themselves, some of them, as they went along, as they got kind of deeper and deeper into it. So one of, I think, both of our favorite, if you will, anecdotes in the book is about one of the mothers, Jane Buckingham. She went to pretty comical lengths to have a cover for her son. So he was supposed to fly to Houston to take the ACT, and then the proctor would, boost the score a little bit. But he was sick, so he couldn't travel. And Buckingham approached Singer and said, is there any way that the proctor can just take the test for him over in Houston while we stay here in Los Angeles? And Singer kind of asked around and said, sure. So he sent a writing sample that the mom got in the doctor's office waiting room for the sick kid. And, he wrote out, to whom it may concern, this is a sample of my writing because there's a portion of the test that requires handwriting. And at some point, after test day, when he was perhaps feeling a little better, Jane Buckingham proctored her own test in her house for her son. She told him that she had gotten permission to proctor it at home. She set him up in the study nook. She kept it timed. She'd come in and say, X minutes left, that sort of thing. And then she put it in an envelope and sent it to Rick Singer, as if mailing it somehow made it legitimate. It did not. But it was just so interesting to see how these people, once they were in the lie, kind of either went deeper and deeper, or in some cases realized this was too much and pulled back.
Yeah, and that was an interesting case. Then I think there were also a lot of cases where this almost fell apart. One of the most remarkable things about this scheme was that you had all these people, like hundreds, dozens of parents, and really more than almost 100 people, involved in some way. And it just kept on for so long. And you'd think, how do you hold this all together? And you had to keep the kids quiet, if keep them from knowing. And like in the case of Jack, her son, he actually was going around at school saying, my mom proctored my test. And people were like, that's not a thing. Like, your parent can't proctor your test at home. And rumors got going, and somebody did get on Twitter and said to the ACT, like, hey, I know of a kid whose mom proctored his test at home, and they just sort of blew him off. So there's all these little things that got missed along the way. There was another time where a parent in San Diego wanted her son to go to USC. And so Rick Singer, they had the idea, let's make him a pole vaulter. And doesn't even have a track team at his school. So they make him a pole vaulter. They go as far as to just grab another photo of some real kid off the internet and Photoshop this kid in, and they submit this whole package. And so off this kid goes to USC, and he's at his orientation for the year, and he's sitting down, and somehow it's in his records that he's on the track team. And somebody says to him, one of the advisors says, oh, I see you're on the track team. He says, no, I'm not. And he calls his mom, and he says, they think I'm on the track team. And there's actual phone conversations recorded where she's calling Rick Singer, what do I do? And he says, oh, okay, I'll take care of it. I'll stop this. We'll figure out a plan. And so what he did is he would make up an injury for the kid. He'd call the university. He had inside people at these schools, which is how he could pull this off. And they would make up, if anybody asked questions, he'd tell families, or, okay, the kid had plantar over the summer, they got injured. So they had to make up some reason in case somebody started asking questions.
And this went on, this scheme went on for so long. The federal case pretty much only goes back to 2011, one situation in 2008. But, so this was going on for over a decade, and nobody had caught on enough to really bring it down. And I think that's something that was startling to me, as someone who covers higher ed, who covers admissions, that just there was so little checking, right? There's so little oversight of so many of these things that he could get away with this for so long. There's also inertia and lack of curiosity, right? A high school doesn't necessarily have an incentive to call out a student for exaggerating on their application if it means that kid is getting into a top school and the high school now gets to boast about having a graduate going to that top school. What purpose does that serve for the school to kind of shut that down? So that was really perhaps frustrating but enlightening part of the reporting. But all of those curious people, all of that, that's not what brought it all down.
That's right. This case was uncovered by accident. It's an amazing story. That what happened was in 2018, the SEC in Boston, Securities and Exchange Commission, got a tip about an investor fraud, and they started looking into it. And it involved this complex set of characters and multi-country scheme. But it was pretty basic. It was like a pump and dump where you're inflating stock and then selling it and hiding ownership. And so one of the guys involved lived in LA. So they sent this over to the US Attorney's Office, and then they go to in Boston, and they raid his house. And his name is Maury Tobin. He lives in Hancock Park in LA in a enormous house with about like 10 chimneys on top, big French chateau kind of thing.
You need a lot of chimneys in Los Angeles.
It's just remarkable, the number of chimneys on that house, surrounded by palm trees. He's got this beautiful family, several daughters. They go to the Marlborough School, just a really one of the best private schools in LA, and he's got this seemingly charmed life. They go in, they take his computer and documents, and so at this point he's implicated in a stock fraud. And like many people who are targeted in a white collar crime, he went into the government to quickly cooperate and make a deal. So he didn't want to go to jail, and so he went in and he was going to help them. He offered to help them crack this case and figure out and go out and give information about how it all worked. But in these cases, before the government agrees to do that, they want to know everything about you, and they call it Queen for the Day, where you go in and you tell them everything and you have some immunity. But they want to know everything about you before they decide you're going to be a government witness, because they don't want the defense lawyers to be able to attack your key witness. So if you've ever, neglected to pay child support or whatever, they have to find out everything. So they looking at his bank records, and they see money moving from Maury Tobin to Connecticut, an account, and they ask what this is about, and he just says, I am bribing the coach of the Yale women's soccer team to get my daughter in, and I've been making payments since the previous summer, and
it was not with Rick Singer. This
was a side thing. So there was no Rick Singer mentioned, and so of course the prosecutors are sitting there, and you can imagine they're like, this sounds a little more interesting than a stock fraud case. And so one of them just like runs down to his boss after, and he says, this sounds like a more, this sounds fascinating. So they start to pursue that. And then what they do is they set up a sting with Maury Tobin and the coach of Yale at a hotel in Boston. And they get him up there and they have him on camera. And the two of them are haggling over the last payments. And so they flip the coach of Yale, they arrest him, and then they flip him, and he agrees to cooperate with the government. So they now have Tobin and the coach of Yale. And during that meeting where he's meeting with Maury Tobin, he mentions a Rick Singer, and that's the first time they've heard of him.
Yeah, and it snowballed from there with wiretaps. And one of the reasons that this story is so rich and the book has so much dialogue is there were wiretaps and consensually recorded calls and wiretaps up for many months on the phones of a number of individuals. So we have these conversations. We get to see these deals playing out in real time in summer and fall of 2018 as the criminal case is kind of coming together back in Boston, which was, wonderful for us to have as a resource for writing. It also means that the FBI affidavit and some of the court documents, I mean, they read like fiction. They're just amazing dialogue and these full conversations. It was kind of a pleasure to read some of them.
Oh, you can't even like make it up. I mean, they when they started tapping Rick Singer's phone in June of 2018, it was just like a gusher went off, and he would call parents and just lay out his entire scheme as if he was selling a car, and you could do this and you could do that, and they're just basically shopping, and some parents are calling him. And then when they finally flipped Rick Singer, he's such a competitive guy that he does everything he does. He just wants to win. It's almost more about winning for him, it seems like, than getting rich, although he did get rich. And he just decides he's going to be the best witness ever. And he comes in and they set him up in the conference room and they give him a ruse to call parents and just try to reel them in. And he turns out to be really good at it. And that's why you saw a lot of people plead very early in this case, because it was just their own voice on these tapes.
And just a reminder, if you have any questions, to add them into the chat so that we can answer them. We'll turn to Q&A pretty soon. So, we cover the whole case. We cover the guilty pleas and the sentencings. And then there's this big question of, what does it all mean? Where does this all go from here? And we try not to be preachy in the book, but this scandal does not live in a vacuum. So we dig into kind of what it says about society at large, that people felt this crazy need to go to such lengths to get their kids into college, again, when they were already on a pretty good path. Stephanie and I were talking a little bit before this event began about just, this is a moment when discussions of fairness and equity are really in the national dialogue. So this one scene in the book really, really resonates. I'm going to read a little bit directly. I have it up on my computer screen, so bear with me here for just a sec. And this is something that took place in September of 2019, and the judge is about to sentence Felicity Huffman. So I'm just going to read a couple quick paragraphs here. Presiding over a packed courtroom on Friday, the 13th of September, Judge Talwani held her eyeglasses between her thumb and index finger and peered out at the solemn defendant before her. The judge had been reflecting on why there was a sense of moral outrage in the college admissions case. It wasn't because the public had suddenly discovered that it's not a true meritocracy out there. It wasn't about the financial harm to the colleges or the testing agencies that had generated the technical infighting at the courthouse in recent days. The outrage, she said from the bench, is a system that is already so distorted by money and privilege in the first place. And the outrage, the judge continued, looking directly at actress Felicity Huffman, was, quote, that you took the step of obtaining one more advantage to put your child ahead of theirs. That line from her just so perfectly sums up a lot of why people glommed onto this case and were so frustrated and angry by it and by the actions of these parents. But it also exposed the case and the situation also exposed this larger problem. And Jennifer got the first interview with one of the kids who was technically a beneficiary of the scheme. And I think he really he was so articulate. And we wrote a story about it for the Journal, and we were able to expand on that in the book about his experience.
Yeah, he said that that he just felt the problem was that some parents were just way too invested in their kids' lives, and he said it was gross, and he said it put so much pressure on the kids. And he said the hardest part for him was that he really had worked hard in high school, and he had needed to go to USC. He was interested in several other schools, and he would have been fine with those. But that he said that his parents had always told him, "Oh, you're doing a great job," and that he now didn't know if that was true, and did they ever have confidence in him. And the first thing he told his dad when his dad got home from that day, the first day after his arrest, after he posted bail, he walked in the house and Mateo was in the kitchen, and he just looked at his dad and he said, "Why didn't you believe in me?"
Yeah, that was a rough scene. It was pretty heartbreaking.
It was. He really went through a lot of soul searching, and he was really mad at his father. And then he kind of felt almost sorry for him.
Right. He talked a lot about kind of how he perhaps should have spoken up more and found his own voice. And perhaps he did find his voice by talking to us. He did so kind of outside of the normal chain of command of talking to the lawyers and the PR team for his dad and stuff. He just connected directly, and he was kind of taking back his story in a way. I see we have a couple of questions starting to come in, so keep sending them. We love answering. We love knowing what's on your mind.
Yeah, definitely.
I just want to jump in and first say thank you so much for this discussion. I know you've shared so much with us, and I know there's also a lot more. So I just want to remind people that the fact that we've gotten so much wonderful information from Melissa and Jennifer tonight doesn't mean that you shouldn't also pick up a copy of the book.
Yes, for every anecdote we shared with you, there's like 4 more that are perhaps even more shocking.
Right, because it just gets sort of wilder and more telling. So yes, we obviously encourage you to pick up the book from us or your local indie if you're not in the Asheville area. So I just want to thank you so much, first of all. And yes, a reminder to go ahead and put in more questions. And we do have one from Susan, which was just that, did you interview anyone at USC? And if so, who?
So we'll say off the bat, a lot of the people who spoke with us for the book did so under certain conditions that their names wouldn't be in it, which allowed them to speak more freely. You know, we still corroborated things they said, but part of the agreement was that we can't say all of our sources. One of the rules that we stuck to in our reporting, though, was a rule at the Wall Street Journal, the no surprises. So, we approached everybody who's named and discussed in a significant way and gave them a chance to kind of converse with us about the material and what we might say about them in the book. So yeah, we definitely spoke to a number of people affiliated with former people, current people at USC to work on. There's a whole chapter about USC and why it was perhaps kind of ripe for this sort of scandal and kind of open for some more financial corruption perhaps, but we can't really say exactly who.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, we didn't want to add any sources. We have a question from our own Patricia as well. And Patricia, before we get to your question, I just want to give a shout out to Jennifer Forsyth, who's here on the call tonight. And Jennifer, you don't have to turn on your camera if you don't want to, but Jennifer also works for the Wall Street Journal. She lives here in Asheville, but is actually Deputy Chief of Investigations at Wall Street Journal and works remotely and coordinates a team of reporters and connected us with Melissa and Jennifer for this event. And we appreciate that. So thank you, Jennifer. And Jennifer, if you have any questions or comments from Melissa and Jennifer, feel free to chime in. Patricia, would you like to go ahead and ask your question in case you have a follow-up?
Sure. So a lot of times it seems like in doing an investigation like yours, there might be a gap or something missing. I call it the kind of burning question. Was there somebody or some documents that you'd never got access to that left something that you wish you could have explored more? Are there some unanswered questions? And if so, what are they?
Oh, I love that question.
I know.
Early on in I think it was the first few days, one of our editors started a Google Doc, because everything's in Google Docs, of kind of what are the big things we want to know. And it was, who was the tipster? And we broke that. Who was the student whose family paid $1.2 million for a spot at Yale? And it took us a few months, but we broke that. And it was kind of a checklist of all of the wish list of everyone we want to know, because there are a lot of unnamed people in the court documents, cooperators and things like that. And we kind of worked our way through a lot of them. I'm trying to think if there are any kind of smoking guns we felt like we didn't get.
I felt like we got most of them. I mean, we had so many people we were just dying to get. The big question we wanted to know, we had so many court documents, but we were like, we just have to know how they met. How did he get in with Rick Singer? How did that? And so those were like our big burning questions. And we would just call each other many nights and just be like, oh my God, I just got that. They just agreed to talk with me. They just called back. Or I feel like we got so much. I felt really satisfied at the end with connecting the dots.
We did have, and Jennifer didn't see this as much as I did, because we work out of different offices in the before times when we went to offices. But there was this big whiteboard near my desk that it looked like some sort of a conspiracy theorist sort of thing, like with all the lines connecting names, and there were a bunch of question marks, and bit by bit, we would kind of be able to fill in, but kind of the who connected each parent to Singer, and did they connect to another parent? There were probably a few question marks on there that we never quite got, but they were secondary or tertiary connections. It didn't leave us with that super big hole or mystery in the case.
If I may ask a follow-up, how big is this? Because I think I've certainly heard about cheating in other countries. I'm sure this is not unique, but how big is this, and what would this really bring the whole kind of admittance system to a grinding halt? I sound like a conspiracy theorist now, and I kind of feel like it. But what do you think? How big is this?
Bigger than, we know there are a lot of families that worked with Singer and did perhaps some things that were on the wrong side of legal. But they weren't charged, because it was from a long time ago, or there just wasn't quite enough evidence against them. There were 50 people charged at the beginning. We've seen another about half dozen or 8 kind of throughout over the past year plus, kind of more names trickle out. Just today, I wrote an article about the California state auditor saying that the UC system has kind of a lot of problems with people in admissions using inappropriate factors when they're deciding who to let in. And in that report, they detailed some of the examples, including 22 people, mostly at Berkeley, who were let in. They were flagged as recruits, often at the request of somebody in the advancement in the fundraising office. So if someone fundraising would tell a coach, like, this person's, they've got deep pockets, all of a sudden they were recruited to a team, even if they weren't at that level, and they got in. We don't know how many of them were tied to Rick Singer. We know a few of them were at UCLA. This report looked at a few campuses, but the fact that they went and found 22, and they say in their report there likely were more, but we couldn't quite pin down all of them, and we didn't look at every single sport. This is certainly bigger than Singer, and taking Singer and his web down is not going to stop people from trying to game the system. I'm perhaps cynical and a bit of a Debbie Downer, but it's hard to imagine that we will now have something more pure as a result of this, sadly.
People are always going to chase status, I think.
I'm sorry, I jumped in, Jennifer, before you had a chance.
I was just saying, people are always going to chase status, and there'll always be a market for people.
Yeah.
who will do anything.
So that's actually a perfect segue to a question from Jennifer Forsyth, and who was also reading my mind in terms of a question to ask. And you, and Melissa, you've already you've answered part of this, but I'll invite you to expand a little. And I have a sort of side question to add as well. So Jennifer's asking, do you think this scandal will do anything to make the system fairer or more equitable? Or will parents only realize they have another way to cheat and think that they won't get caught? And then so my side question is, especially, and this is for both of you, but Melissa, I know since you report on higher ed regularly as well, what do you think, what are some of the maybe even just starter steps that need to be taken to make, in light of all of this, and in light of the fact that this is really just an extreme example of existing inequities, like the judge in the case pointed out, that it's, it's really just that this just adds another layer to all of the unfairness that exists already. So if you have ideas about, some things that could happen to make the system fair. So,
right. So the final chapter of the book is titled "A System Reformed?" ? And so that probably tells a fair bit about our views on kind of whether this has cleaned things up. In the immediate aftermath of the scandal, some schools came out and said, we're going to do a better job auditing applications. We'll fact check a few more things, but they can't do that for everybody. They don't have the resources, the time. Admissions officers are under, well, digitally now, but stacks and stacks of paper. So they're not going to go call a high school and double check that somebody was actually the president of the botany club rather than the vice president or whatever, and they continue to trust that coaches have the team's best interest in mind when they're recruiting. But some schools have added kind of another layer now, not just the coach, but maybe an athletic director needs to sign off on a recruit to say, yes, they're really that talented. And so the couple months after the scandal, I think I was feeling maybe a little bit optimistic about my beat that, there was going to be change and we're turning a corner and transparency and equity and all that stuff. And then I went to a conference in Louisville, and I won't give too much of this away because it's in the book, but there's one line that just was repeated by everyone there. And that was, this wasn't an admissions scandal. And this was a conference of admissions officers, college counselors at high schools. And they were saying, none of us were, this wasn't, no college counsel, no kind of legit college counselors, no admissions deans were charged in the case. This wasn't our problem. This was an athletics thing. This was testing, but it wasn't us. Don't blame us. And therefore, we're not the ones who have to fix it. And that was quite disheartening. I do think that the pandemic has actually brought about some of the changes that maybe otherwise would have taken a while to get to. So the biggest one being a lot of colleges going test optional. Some say it's just temporary, some more permanent. But that is one of the kind of big ways of addressing a lot of inequities in access to higher ed. Test scores often correlate with gender and race and socioeconomic status, and generally aren't actually a great predictor of success in college. They're not a better predictor than high school score, high school GPA. So to see a lot of schools get rid of that is kind of a step in the right direction on some of these things. I don't foresee colleges stopping paying attention to really wealthy people anytime soon. And especially because of the pandemic and the financial impact it's had on schools. If anything, I think it's harder for them to look away from somebody who's signaling that they can drop a hefty check.
And Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on that, on sort of the future?
I think that idea of just the money, that I was blown away by the money in admissions. At one point, one of the defense lawyers for one of the parents, he was trying to make the case that this is just another face of an accepted practice that you might find gross, but that goes on, which is that rich people pony up money and have an advantage of getting in. And so he got all these emails and a subpoena from USC, and they were just unbelievable. They were notes from admissions folks or people appealing to admissions folks from different departments to get this person in because they were a donor. So these were people in the school writing in the files of candidates something like father is a surgeon, grandmother is an heir to this or that, and it was so blatant. I think that that whole backdoor donor thing, it is at the root of a lot of this, and I think it's like, I don't know if we just keep hearing that, you need this because it pays for financial aid for other kids and all this, but first, is that true? I don't know. Or is it really going to, like, the coach's salary for football? Is it going to put some lazy river at the school and floor to ceiling windows in the dorms? And then is it just, a friend of mine wrote Price of Admission, Dan Golden, and his argument is like, is it just a lazy form of fundraising? Aren't there libraries and all kinds of places that raise money without giving away all kinds of, something? I mean,
the most you get is a tote bag or something.
Right. So there is kind of, I think the premise that it's just accepted, like, oh, colleges, this is just something they have to do I think maybe it's time to say, why do they need all this money? And because I do think it fuels a Rick Singer in a way.
And Jennifer mentioned the book, The Price of Admission, which definitely helped inform our reporting. We reference it in the book.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating read. Came out about 15 years ago or so. Definitely would recommend as well. I'm trying to think. There are probably a few other books that informed. We read Smartest Guys in the Room and Bad Blood as we kind of embarked on the book project as just models for what we wanted to do, what we hoped to do.
Conspiracy of Fools, the Enron case. That was a real model for us too.
Yeah.
Recreating scenes. I think we have another question. Patricia.
Patricia has another question, and Patricia's also busy posting books in these books that you mentioned in chat. Patricia, I'm going to read out your question if that's okay. Yeah. And so, and this actually goes back again to we're all well timed in our minds. Patricia's asking, what about standardized testing? You mentioned that some schools are just doing away with using test scores, which on a personal note I agree actually is a good step towards equity. But she's asking about the fact that there seems to be deep corruption there and a lot of money made for the corporations who create and sell the tests. And it seems like ample opportunity with enough money to game that system.
Yeah, so the College Board, which runs the SAT and the AP exams, is actually technically a nonprofit. It's like $1 billion nonprofit. But they and the ACT dominate the space. Their responses to the scandal are interesting because they do outsource a lot of the actual test administration. You have high school teachers and assistant coaches and guidance counselors. They're the ones who go in on a Saturday and administer the test and proctor it. And, you need kind of this army of volunteers to help do it. Actually, in this case, during the pandemic, we've seen some of them kind of revolt and say, I don't feel safe doing that. And test centers have closed and not offered the test. But that was more about safety than kind of moral issues. I think it is worth, as more schools drop these tests, it's going to be interesting to see what states continue to have them. Some states require them as, part of graduation from high school. They have, statewide contracts. And I'm really curious to see what happens with those as fewer and fewer schools require it. Why are these students still taking them then?
Yeah, and I would add to that too. Just along the way, one of the stories we did in the Wall Street Journal, and we get into this in the book as well, is the accommodations, having kids tested for learning differences and then getting extra time on the test. So that was the key for Rick Singer. He had to do that, but he's far from the only one that does that. And we looked into it and we found schools where just an astronomical number of kids were getting extra time on the SAT, and by and large they were affluent schools, and where parents had the money to go for
like a $10,000 assessment, and
to say, now many kids really need these, and so it's not to say like, and they should continue to get them, but this kind of thing like diminishes them and makes it harder for those kids. But so there's something there. And we talked with a school at one point in Orange County, a private school, and they just, the head of school said, it just got to the point where something like 80% of the kids had special situations. I need to be in a private room, I need this. And he says, something is wrong. And they noticed them coming from just a couple doctors. And they noticed the tests were just vague and the diagnosis were all the same. That the solution was all the same, extra time. And so they decided they were going to review it with their own person. They brought in their own team of clinicians, and they reviewed it, and they just knocked out like half of them. I would say, this reminds me, somebody asked, what was the thing you didn't get? We wanted to know who Rick Singer's doctor was, who his go-to, like, you know, somebody has a pill mill. Well, he had like a pill mill for the testing that he would send parents to. And we did kind of start to get some names at the end, but that was a nut we never cracked. And we kept thinking there was going to be charges against him or her, and we kept chasing that.
I believe there's some notes with some names in a notebook sitting at my desk at the office that I haven't been to in 6+ months. So someday I'll go back to get that notebook and we'll pick it back up. There's still, it's a good time to say, like, there's still a lot more to this story, right? There's trials of parents who have pleaded not guilty. Those will be early next year. There's going to be trials for some coaches and others. So, you know, hopefully at some point we'll write an epilogue or an afterwards and here's what's happened now.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Patricia.
I was a public school teacher in Texas, and I administered some of those standardized tests for 4 years. And I proctored those tests. And that was back in the 90s. And so I have a kind of a little history with that, and I'm really interested in your findings and how big it is, because a state like Texas, where things are done, well, even textbooks are purchased statewide. They do statewide adoptions. It's a big money maker, and the stakes are very high for revenue generations, and it's deeply politicized. So I feel like you two could spend the rest of your careers, and I hope you do, because there's a whole scam going on in public education as well that I feel like I'm just waiting for the two of you to blow the lid off of it.
And very quickly, we had another question that I accidentally skimmed past, and maybe you could give a quick answer to, which from Susan, because we've been talking about high profile, high prestige schools, right, that people are jumping through these hoops for. But is this only for top tier schools? And are similar things happening elsewhere?
So there are many, many schools that admit anybody who applies. There are many schools that admit well over half of applicants. So the competition to get in isn't so fierce, right? It's not so hard to stand out from the crowd of perfect 1,600 SATs and 8 varsity sports and all of that. So, you know, with the stakes not as high, or, you know, the chances of getting in are pretty good. So you don't necessarily need to kind of puff yourself up more. That said, again, there's nobody checking anyway. So we're not sure. People could be, you know, because for some people, that school that admits 60%, you know, there's still 40% being rejected. So it's a reach school for some students, and they will try to find a way in potentially. But I think the likelihood of it is really, you know, people are looking to game the system for the schools that admit 7, 6, 5% of their applicants.
I think there was a case, interesting case. I think is it University of Illinois? where they had a scam where politically connected people were giving away spots. They were basically like forcing the college to give slots to their kids, friends' kids, or in return for donations and that kind of thing. So the school, I think at some point they did something sort of drastic, right? Didn't they just stop?
Yeah, so a bunch of schools have tried to reform this, and we'll see what happens with the University of California now, with this state auditor report saying kind of, you have to stop using those outside influences as a factor in admissions. A bunch of schools have tried to stop in some way, but whether they can really do it and just look at merit, that's hard.
Yeah. Well, that's perhaps not a high note to end on, but a good one. We can always hope that at least having this out in the open, sunlight being the best disinfectant and all, at least it will move things perhaps forward and get some more people looking at the deep inequities that exist that help to make this possible, and perhaps do something about it. So we'll hope for that, and continue to think about about where, for me it's so much about where we are as a society, that we're at this point, and that parents get to this point, and that the influence of money and certain levels of prestige, sort of tip the scales in this way in people's internal lives, as well as, in their interactions with other people, and sort of blind us, to what's going on with folks. So I'm just so appreciative of your work on this. I'm appreciative of journalists in general. We are grateful to you for your work. It's important for democracy and civilization, what you do. And so we thank you. And thank you for this book. And thank everyone for coming this evening. We appreciate it. And I know we're a few minutes over, but Melissa and Jennifer, if you have any last thing to say before we leave.
No, really appreciate you guys coming to this, and hope you buy the book because there's so much more in it.
I would echo that, and this was a real privilege to speak with you.
No pun intended.
Yes, right. All right.
That would be unacceptable.
Get here.
Thank you for admitting me.
We should have been doing that all night.
I know.
We missed an opportunity. Thank you all so much. Everybody who's with us, I know some people I think had to duck out at 7 because there's so much going on these days, but thank you so much for sticking with us and for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you again. And please do pick up the book. Melissa and Jennifer have done wonderful work, and it deserves even more of your attention. So good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.